She had 7 years of honest references, 2 dresses, and absolutely no business being anywhere near a duke. She kissed him anyway, because someone was about to kill him, and she was the only one who saw it coming. If you have ever wanted a love story where the woman does not wait to be rescued, this one is for you. Subscribe so you never miss a story, and leave a comment below. Would you have been brave enough to do what Nora did? The roses at Ashworth Manor were the pride of every gardener in 3 counties, and on the afternoon of the 6th of June, 1823, they were in merciless bloom. Pink and ivory flowers cascaded over wrought iron trellises, their perfume so thick in the summer heat that the ladies fanning themselves beneath the striped canopies seemed almost drunk on it. The lawns had been trimmed to a fine green carpet. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays, lifted and replaced with the practiced invisibility of trained hands. The season was at its apex, and Lord and Lady Ashworth had, as they did every year, thrown open their gardens to the finest blood in England. Nora Wickham did not belong there. She knew it the way she had always known things, not from anyone telling her, but from the particular quality of the silence that fell when women of consequence noticed her moving through their periphery. A certain kind of woman had a talent for making a servant feel the exact dimensions of her invisibility without saying a single word. Nora had been the recipient of that talent many times. She had learned to receive it without flinching. She was 22 years old, and she had spent the better part of those years learning to read rooms she was not supposed to be in. She had been hired 3 weeks prior as an under-housemaid at Ashworth Manor, and today she had been tasked with replenishing the champagne, carrying loaded trays from the kitchen to the serving tables at the garden's far edge, collecting empty glasses, returning, repeating. It was invisible work. That was entirely the point. She was good at invisible. She had survived on it. Nora had grown up in Suffolk on the south bank of the Thames, in the part of London that polite society preferred not to think about directly. Her mother had been a washerwoman, capable, quiet, dead of fever when Nora was 8 years old. Her father was a name she had been given once and had not pursued. She had learned to read from a primer she found wedged under a market stall on Borough High Street, carrying it home pressed against her chest like something stolen from a church, sounding out the letters by the light of a tallow candle until words stopped being foreign shapes and became, instead, the most reliable companions she had ever known. Books did not leave. Books did not die. Books did not decide one morning that you were a burden they could no longer carry. She had worked since she was 9. Laundry first, hours of it, her hands in scalding water until they cracked and bled, and she learned to treat them with tallow before sleep. Then kitchens, where she discovered that she was quick and organized and did not need to be told things twice, which were qualities that certain households valued enormously, and which she learned to present carefully in references. By her late teens, she had accumulated enough honest references, cultivated over years, never invented, never embellished, to secure a position in a proper house. She did not dream of grand things. She dreamed of stability. A room with a latch on the door that she did not have to share with 4 other people. Enough food that she stopped waking in the night thinking about it. The ability to choose, once in a while, how she spent a Sunday afternoon. Small dreams, the kind that survive. She was crossing the far edge of the lawn on her 3rd trip from the kitchen, a tray of fresh glasses balanced with the practiced ease of someone who had never been able to afford to drop things, when she saw the Duke. She recognized him not because she had been introduced, they had never spoken and were unlikely to, but because the crowd moved differently around him. People who held real power in a room always created a certain kind of gravity. Others bent toward them, or, just as tellingly, gave them careful distance while pretending not to. Sterling Halloway, the 5th Duke of Callanvale, had been a subject of below-stairs conversation since the moment Nora arrived at Ashworth Manor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. The footmen lowered their voices when his name came up. Even the most irrepressibly gossipy of the kitchen maids went oddly flat when discussing him, as if there were things about the Duke too complicated to distill into a good story. He was standing near the far rose trellis, slightly apart from the main gathering. He held a glass of champagne he had not drunk from. He was speaking to a man Nora did not recognize. A man in a coat too fine for the heat, with a smile that was doing a great deal of work and a stillness about him that was not the same as composure. It was the stillness of something coiled, something held in a particular position because releasing it required timing. Nora would not have noticed any of this, not normally. She had made a discipline of not noticing things that were not her concern. The survival of a person in her position depended on a highly selective attention. See what you need to see. Do not see what will get you dismissed. Keep your eyes at precisely the right level and your expression precisely the right distance from anything that could be interpreted as curiosity. But the man in the fine coat had shifted in a way she recognized. A precise, practiced motion of his right hand toward the inside of his jacket. Not casual, not incidental, the kind of motion a person makes when they have made it many times before and their body has memorized it. His fingers had found the handle of something slim and flat against his ribs, and the angle of his wrist told her exactly what it was. A knife, small enough to conceal, long enough to matter. She had seen one used. Her mind went perfectly blank. Then her body moved. She set the tray down on the nearest surface, which happened to be a garden bench belonging to a viscountess who would later describe the incident in very dramatic terms to her daughter, crossed 12 feet of manicured lawn in 7 seconds, took the Duke of Callanvale by the lapel of his jacket, and kissed him on the mouth in front of approximately 60 members of the English aristocracy. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. He went rigid the moment she touched him. She had expected that and had braced for it, had committed to it the way you commit to a decision made in the space before thought catches up. Then, for one bewildering half-second, he did not pull away. She felt him breathe. She felt the hand that had been at his side move, involuntary, half an inch toward her arm. Then the crowd's collective intake of breath reached them both like a wave of cold water, and he stepped back. The man in the fine coat was gone. Nora became aware, in very rapid succession, of the following things. 60 pairs of eyes fixed on her face, including a countess whose eyebrows had reached an unprecedented altitude, a champagne glass shattering somewhere to her left, dropped by a footman who had been watching. Mrs. Price standing at the terrace steps with an expression that conveyed, without words, that Nora's employment at Ashworth Manor had just ended, and the Duke of Callanvale looking at her with an intensity that had no name she could immediately locate in her experience. He was not angry. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected fury. The cold, clipped, diamond-hard fury of a man whose dignity had been publicly desecrated by a maid. What she saw instead was something more complicated. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he has not yet solved, but finds, despite himself, deeply interesting. Your Grace. Her voice came out steady. She had survived too much in her 22 years to lose her steadiness now. And she was grateful for that, because her heart was hammering loudly enough that she was surprised it wasn't visible through the fabric of her dress. Forgive the intrusion. I believe you had something on your coat. The 60 aristocrats waited. The garden held its breath. Even the roses seemed to lean in. Sterling Halloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a quality in his voice that was not quite dry, but lived in the same neighborhood, "So it appears." He said nothing else. He offered no explanation to the watching crowd, no condescending social remark to ease the rupture, no gesture that would contextualize or diminish or rescue anyone from what had just happened. He simply turned and walked toward the house, as if the matter were settled, which left 60 aristocrats staring at Nora, and Nora standing alone on the lawn with her hands at her sides, and the distinct impression that she had set something in motion that she did not yet fully understand. She was dismissed by Mrs. Price within the hour. It was done with the brisk, practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this particular task many times and had no appetite for prolonging it. Nora was given her wages for the 3 weeks worked, 2 shillings and 4 pence, counted out on the housekeeper's desk with a precision that itself communicated something. told that her references would not be affected, and informed that her room would need to be vacated by morning. The reference mercy was real. Mrs. Price was a fair woman, if not a warm one, and the fairness extended to recognizing that Nora had not behaved improperly in any conventional sense. What she had done was inexplicable and professionally catastrophic, but it was not dishonest and it was not immoral. And those were the categories that mattered to Mrs. Price. Nora packed her 2 dresses, her 4 books, and the small tin box where she kept her money. She sat on the edge of the stripped mattress and thought, with the clear and practical mind she had developed specifically for moments when sentimentality was an indulgence she couldn't afford. She had done it without thinking, which was not strictly accurate. She had done it in the space between thought and action, in the half-second where the calculating mind had not yet caught up with the knowing one. She did not regret it. The man had been reaching for something, and whatever it was not a pocket watch. She had moved, and the man had gone, and the Duke was standing and breathing, and that was the relevant arithmetic. What she regretted, in the cold and practical way she regretted things, was the absence of a plan for what came after. She was still sitting there, in the dimming light of the servants' hall window, calculating options with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had never had the luxury of not calculating options, when the knock came at the door. It was not Mrs. Price. It was a footman she had not seen before. Tall, impeccably turned out, with the practiced blankness of someone who served a household that valued discretion above nearly everything else. He told her, without expression, that His Grace wished to see her, in the study, now. She followed him through the back passages of the manor and up a servants' stair she had not known existed, and found herself in a room that she absorbed in approximately 4 seconds. Floor-to-ceiling books, organized by some system she could not immediately identify. A fire burned down to embers. 2 oil lamps on a desk that was clean in the way that only truly organized people keep a desk clean, where the absence of clutter was itself a form of intention. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her. He did not turn when she entered. She waited. She had always been patient. Impatience was a luxury of people who could afford to make noise. "You saw him reach for it," Sterling said, still not turning. His voice was quieter than she had expected, given the gravity of everything surrounding it. "Yes." "How? Specifically?" "The angle of the elbow. The way the weight of the body shifts when the reach is deliberate rather than habitual. I have seen it before." "Where?" "Southwark, when I was 8. A pause. "The man I saw it on had been paid to use it. I don't know who paid him. The man he used it on died." Sterling turned then. She had been right about the complexity of his expression. He was looking at her with the same assessing quality she had seen on the lawn, stripped now of the social performance that had surrounded it. And it was in some ways more unsettling in the lamplight than it had been in the garden, because there was nothing around it to soften it. "You grew up in Southwark," he said. "You asked about me." It came out without accusation. She was simply noting the fact. "In the 3 hours between the garden and this room." "Yes." He did not apologize for it. "You taught yourself to read. You have worked in 4 households in the last 7 years. Every reference you carry is genuine." He paused, with a quality that might have been reluctance in a less controlled person. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who kissed me for a different reason." The quality of the silence that followed was something she was careful not to disturb. "I kissed you because it was the fastest way to move you without causing the kind of panic that would have made him act immediately. A scene between a servant and a duke holds an entire crowd's attention for exactly long enough. I needed him to lose the moment. He lost it." 4 seconds. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. The fire crackled once and subsided. Outside, the last of the party guests were being seen to their carriages, the murmur of departures drifting through the windows. "This man," she said. "Who is he?" He moved to the desk, opened a drawer, and produced a folded note. She took it, unfolded it, and read it in the lamplight. The handwriting was precise and educated, the language carefully oblique, in the way that people write when they want to be understood without being provable. But the meaning was not oblique. Someone knew something about the Holloway family. Someone wanted the Duke to know they knew it. And if the Duke valued the continued silence of that someone, then a certain arrangement ought to be reached at the earliest opportunity. She refolded the note and set it on the desk between them. "The man at the party," she said. "He sent this. Marquess Voss." The name landed in the room with a weight that was itself information. "He and my family have a complicated history. He was not at the party to negotiate." Sterling's jaw tightened, the only visible fracture in the composure, and then smoothed again. "No, he was not." A pause. "I had become something of an obstacle to his plans." Nora looked at the note. She looked at the man. She looked at the study with its organized books and its dying fire and the lamps that would need attention by morning. She understood with complete clarity that she was standing in a room full of things that were not her business, and that the man in front of her was about to make them her business anyway. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Sterling was quiet for a moment that stretched. When he spoke, what he said was not what she had expected, and what she had expected had already been more than she'd prepared for. "I want you to stay." He offered her a position as his personal secretary. The offer came with a salary that was nearly 3 times what she had been earning as a housemaid, a room on the second floor, and the kind of stated rationale, estate correspondence, account management, the reorganization of a system that had been failing for 18 months, that was too specific and too plausible to be invention. The unstated rationale she filed away to examine later. The household's reaction was exactly what she would have predicted. Mrs. Price received the information with a stillness that lasted a full 10 seconds before she asked, with exquisite restraint, whether His Grace was entirely well. The footmen discussed it in low voices at mealtimes. The kitchen maids discussed it in considerably less low voices at other times. The story that circulated, as stories always will in a servants' hall, had her as a designing woman who had caught the Duke's eye with the garden stunt, a version she neither confirmed nor denied, because the truth was both stranger and more personal than they would have believed anyway. She moved into a room on the second floor. It was not the servants' quarters, which were on the 4th, and it was not the family wing, which was on the 1st. It occupied the ambiguous middle territory where secretaries, companions, and the miscellaneous necessary people of a great house were housed. It had a window that overlooked the kitchen garden. It had a writing desk. It had a wardrobe with actual space in it. It had a latch on the door. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that. She had learned, over many years, that allowing herself to feel things about small mercies was a fast road to devastation when those mercies were taken away. So she noted the latch with the same practical acknowledgement she gave everything useful, and she went to work. Her actual duties were, she discovered, precisely what he had described. Sterling Holloway had correspondence that had been accumulating in a state of organized neglect for 18 months. Estate accounts that required someone with enough mathematical understanding to read them clearly and enough discretion not to discuss their contents in the kitchen. And a household management system that had been running on the institutional memory of people who were leaving and not being replaced. Nora was good at all of it. She had always been good at making order from chaos. It was among the most foundational skills of growing up poor, where chaos was the natural state and order, something you assembled by hand, daily, or lost entirely. She worked in his study every morning from 8 until noon. He was usually there. They did not talk, most of the time. She read documents and wrote letters in a clear, economical hand that he never asked her to change. She organized correspondence by urgency and subject and left it at the corner of his desk. He read what she left and occasionally corrected something and occasionally added notes in the margin in a handwriting that was decisive and slightly cramped, and which she found herself learning the way she had learned everything, by paying close attention, long enough that the unfamiliar became readable. She was paying too much attention. She knew it. She did not stop. Voss did not reappear in the first week, but his presence was in the house anyway. In the note that sat in the locked drawer of the desk, in the sealed letters that arrived occasionally with an unfamiliar crest, which Sterling set aside and did not open in her presence. in the particular quality of stillness that sometimes settled over him in the middle of reading something. A stillness that had a different texture from his usual composure, more like a person bracing against something they cannot see coming. On the 9th day, she asked him directly. She had been composing a letter at her desk, the morning light coming in at the angle that she had already begun to use as a kind of clock, and she looked up and said, "Tell me about Voss. That falls outside your purview." "It became my purview," she said, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the exact sentence. "The moment I put my mouth on yours to prevent him from putting a blade in you. I have worked here 9 days. I have handled your accounts, managed your correspondence, and kept my own counsel on a great many things I have noticed and not remarked upon. I am asking you, now, to tell me what I am in the middle of." A long pause. The particular silence she was becoming fluent in. Outside, someone was trimming the hedges, and the sound of shears reached them in slow, meditative rhythms. "My father," Sterling said finally, still looking at the document in his hands rather than at her, "was not a good man." He told her the rest of it over the following hour, in his contained, precise voice. The voice of a man who had been carrying something for a long time, and had learned to hold it level. Gerald Halloway, the 4th Duke of Callanvale, had died in October 1818, at the age of 63, having held the title for 27 years. He had acquired it in 1791 through a series of events that were, in the formal language of the law, entirely regular. In the plain language that Nora applied to things in her own mind, the previous holder of the dukedom, a young man of 29 named Robert Voss, the elder brother of the current Marquess, had been found dead in circumstances that were ruled an accident, and were not. Robert Voss had died in a fall from his horse on a country road in Kent on a November night in 1791. He was the only son of the previous Marquess. The title and income passed to a younger branch, the Dukedom of Callanvale, which had been created for Robert Voss by royal patent just 6 months before his death, passed through a legal process of transfer that Gerald Halloway had arranged, through connections in Parliament and considerable expenditure, to go in his direction. The younger brother, Henry Voss, 17 years old in 1791, old enough to see, old enough to suspect, and in possession of a letter that his brother had written to him the week before he died, describing a threat he had received, had kept everything he knew for 32 years. Not because he was patient by nature, because Gerald Halloway had been generous, and because Henry Voss had been young and frightened and, by the time he was old enough to be neither of those things, already dependent on the arrangement. "He has the letter," Sterling said. "Not from my father to his brother, from my father to the man he employed. The man kept it. Insurance, presumably. My father died before he could retrieve it. Voss acquired it from the man's family after his death, and used it as leverage. For 5 years, since my father died and I inherited." Sterling set down the document he had been holding. "He does not want public exposure. If he exposes me, the title reverts, the matter enters the courts, and he loses the one asset he has. What he wants is compliance. A duke who owes him a debt that can never be repaid and must be serviced, indefinitely, in whatever currency he demands. And now his debts are too large," Nora said, "and he needs a larger currency. His estates have been mismanaged for a decade. He owes more than they produce. He wants the letter to become money, immediately, and if I will not negotiate—" He stopped. He would rather there be no one left to negotiate with. "Yes." Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she had seen in the garden. The coiled quality of the man in the fine coat. The precision of the reach. You were going to let him do it. Sterling did not answer, which was its own answer. You were going to let him kill you, rather than negotiate or disclose. Because if the secret comes out... "If the secret comes out," he said, very quietly, "my mother loses everything. She is 62 years old. She has spent her entire adult life as a duchess. The title, the house, the estate income, all of it contingent on the legitimacy of a dukedom that was built on a crime I did not commit, did not know about until I was 22, and cannot undo." He looked at her directly, for the first time in the conversation. She did not know either. She has never known. How did you find out? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, my father was ill in 1811, the first serious illness, not the one that eventually killed him. The physicians gave him a poor prognosis and he believed it. And he had the particular compulsion of men who have carried a secret alone for 20 years. The need, when the end appears, to put the weight down somewhere before it goes unwitnessed into the dark. His voice remained level throughout this, the way it remained level for everything, but she could hear what it cost him. He called me into his study. He told me. He recovered. He lived another 7 years. We never spoke of it again. Not once. Not an allusion. Not a word. As if the confession had been a transaction, and once completed required no acknowledgement. A pause. He was that kind of man. There was nothing she could say to that. She did not try. She looked at him. This contained careful man who had spent 5 years carrying the weight of someone else's sin in absolute silence, who had developed the kind of stillness that only accumulates in a person who has no other outlet for the thing pressing against the inside of them. And she felt something shift in her chest. Not pity. Something more complicated. Something that recognized, in the shape of his particular burden, an echo of her own. The way the past sat on a person, immovable, and the things you built around it because there was no way to remove it from the foundation. There is another way, she said. He looked at her. Find the letter, destroy it, and let Voss talk to anyone he likes. She spent 3 weeks preparing. She walked past the Marquess Voss's Mayfair townhouse 4 times before she allowed herself to examine it directly. She noted the service entrance, the window arrangement relative to the street, the timing of deliveries, and the hours when the knocker suggested a household in active use versus one that had been left to its skeleton staff. She noted the name of the household's wine merchant from a delivery she observed on her second pass and paid the delivery boy a penny to tell her who placed the order. The person who placed the order turned out to be a butler who had worked for Voss for 11 years and who had, she discovered through the careful cultivation of a conversation at a Cheapside market, a particular grievance about unpaid wages. She did not pursue that avenue. It was too visible. Instead, she found the former housemaid. The woman's name was Ada Brewster, and she had left Voss's employment in March of that year, and she was now working 2 streets away for a retired colonel and his wife, and she did not have to be asked twice about the Marquess's habits. He was, Ada said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to say it to the right person, entirely predictable. Card party, every Thursday, never home before 2. Kept his private papers in the study on the ground floor because he did not trust the upper floors, and his valuables in the Italian writing desk because everyone in his set kept their valuables in Italian writing desks, and he had never had an original idea in his life. Nora thanked her, paid for her coffee, and went back to Callanvale House to tell Sterling what she intended. He did not take it well, initially. She had anticipated this and let him work through it. You would be caught, he said. I wouldn't. If you are apprehended in the home of... I grew up in Southwark. She kept her voice level. I spent years learning to move through spaces where I was not supposed to be. I understand locks that are decorative rather than functional. I know how to read a household's rhythms from the outside. And I now know the interior of Voss's ground floor in sufficient detail to navigate it in the dark. A pause. Achie, I'm not asking your permission. I'm informing you, because you should know what is being done and why, in case something goes wrong. Nothing is going to go wrong. In case. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind the composure. She was getting better at reading that interior weather. You have already spoken to someone about the layout. The former housemaid. Yes, 3 days ago. The almost smile, there and gone. You began the day I told you about the letter. I began the day you implied there was a letter, and then declined to tell me what was in it. She folded her hands on the desk. I have been your secretary for 3 weeks. You tell me everything except the things that matter most. I fill in the rest. Nora, her name in his mouth. She had noticed, the first time, and then noticed herself noticing, and then forced herself to stop noticing, in exactly the same way she had forced herself not to feel anything about the latch on the door. She was running out of categories. "I am going with you," he said. The argument that followed lasted 40 minutes and resolved in his favor, which she allowed only because she had calculated that having him present was operationally manageable, and that arguing further would cost more time than it was worth. They went on a Thursday in July, which was the 23rd of the month, when the heat had finally broken, and London was doing the peculiar thing it did in the wake of a heat wave. Breathing out, collective and relieved. Voss was at his card party in St. James's. Nora knew this with reasonable certainty from 2 independent sources. Getting Sterling into civilian clothing was its own challenge. He owned nothing that did not signal exactly what he was, and what he could borrow from the male staff was the wrong dimension on every axis. They settled on a dark coat she found in the back of his wardrobe that he had purchased, he said, for a country walking expedition 7 years prior and never repeated. He moved, even in it, like someone who had never needed to be unnoticed. "You move like every room belongs to you," she told him, as they walked toward Mayfair at a careful pace, not too fast, not slow enough to be memorable. "You need to move like you are not entirely sure." "I am not entirely sure." This is unprecedented behavior for a duke. Then use that. Let it show. She glanced at him. He had adjusted slightly, a fractional change in posture, the kind of thing that only worked because it came from inside rather than from imitation. She filed that away, too. "Better. You are remarkably authoritative," he said, "for a person I outrank by approximately 14 social strata." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight you are a man who needs my help. Act accordingly." The silence that followed had a quality she had not encountered before, something in it that was warm rather than neutral, and which she did not examine, because the Voss townhouse was now visible at the end of the street. She got them through the service entrance in under a minute. The lock was a common pattern. She had practiced on its model the previous week on a lock she'd bought at a hardware shop off the Strand. And it yielded with a sound that was nothing. A small sound. A sound the city swallowed entirely. Inside, the house smelled of furniture wax and something faintly sour, the smell of rooms that were kept up but not loved. She navigated by sound, keeping them away from the kitchen where the residual staff were audible in conversation, moving through the back passage toward the ground floor study. Sterling followed at her pace, as she had told him to, without touching anything, without speaking. She could feel his presence behind her, not the presence of a man she had to manage, which was what she had prepared for, but the presence of someone who had decided to trust her absolutely, and who was holding to that decision with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. The study door was unlocked. She had expected that. The staff who remained would have no reason to lock an interior door. The Italian writing desk was against the far wall, exactly where Ada had described. A piece of furniture that was more display than function. Marquetry inlay. Gilded handles, the kind of thing that told you more about the man who owned it than anything he kept inside it. The third drawer from the top on the right side had a lock that was decorative in exactly the way she had been told. She had it open in 37 seconds. Inside, the letter, folded twice, sealed once, with a crease along the upper left edge that suggested it had been refolded many times. She recognized the handwriting on the outer fold from documents she had handled in the Callanvale study. She took it and held it out to Sterling without reading it. He took it with both hands. She heard his breathing change. A sharp, barely audible change. The kind a person makes when something they have been bracing against for years has suddenly, unexpectedly, resolved into a shape small enough to hold. She looked away. That moment was his, and she had no right to it. They were back on the street in 11 minutes. They walked 3 blocks in silence. The night was warm, and the city was busy around them, indifferent to everything they had just done. Then Sterling said, in a voice rougher than his usual register, as if the control had worn thin in one small place, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He will know by morning." "Yes, which means we need to be ready." He stopped walking. She stopped a half-step later and turned to look at him. And what she saw in his face, in the precise arrangement of release and remaining weight, the particular way relief looks on a person who has lived without it for a long time, was the most exposed thing she had seen from him. More exposed than the garden had been, because that had been fear, and this was something else. Something the fear had been keeping closed. "I know what comes next," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks, longer than 3 weeks." She looked at him. The street was busy around them. Gas lamps made pools of warm light at intervals and left the spaces between in a darkness that was not absolute, but was private, in its way. "Take me home," she said, "and tell me there." He burned the letter in the study fireplace at midnight. Nora watched it catch, the paper curling at the edges first, the handwriting disappearing into flame in a way that had its own small violence. And she thought about the 27 years that letter had existed. Kept, passed between hands she would never know, traded for money and compliance and silence. The weight of all those years, and now it was nothing. Ash and a smell of old paper. Sterling stood at the mantelpiece afterward, with one hand resting on the marble and his back to the room, and she let him have that. She sat at her desk and did not speak, and the fire that had consumed the letter burned down to embers, and the house was quiet around them. When he finally turned, there was something different in his face, not relief exactly. She had seen relief on him, in the street outside Voss's house, and this was past it. Something on the other side of relief, where the weight was gone, and the person discovered they did not know quite what to do with the space it left. "He will still talk," she said. Not to break the silence, but because it was true, and she believed in truth being spoken plainly. He can talk without evidence from now until the end of the century. A man with no proof, telling a story about a crime committed in 1791, 32 years ago, against a title that has been publicly held and socially accepted for his entire adult life. Sterling moved away from the mantel and sat down, heavily, in the chair across from her desk. Not the posture of a duke, the posture of a man who was very tired. It becomes gossip, and gossip requires something to stick to. You're going to make sure there's nothing for it to stick to. "I have already begun." He looked at her. "I retained a solicitor in September. A legal review of the title history is being compiled. A historian, who does not know who retained him or why, is preparing a scholarly account of the relevant period. Both will be completed before winter." He paused. "Shh, when Voss speaks, and he will speak into a wall of documentation and established narrative and people who will believe the Duke over the man with debts." Nora absorbed this, thought about it from several angles, the way she examined things. "You planned this before we went to retrieve the letter?" "The legal and historical preparation, yes. The retrieval was not planned." A pause. You planned the retrieval. I planned it after you declined too." The almost smile, steadier this time. "I had noticed that." She looked at him across the desk. The fire was low. The lamps were burning well. The room smelled of ash and old books and the particular nighttime quality of a house that had settled into itself. She thought about the fact that she had been in this room every morning for nearly a month, that she had organized every piece of paper in it, that she knew the handwriting on the estate correspondence as well as she knew her own. She thought about what it meant that he had kept her close throughout all of this. "There were things you could have managed without a secretary," she said. "The accounts could have gone to an outside firm. The correspondence could have been managed by Mrs. Price. The Voss problem was yours, and you had been managing it alone for 5 years." "Yes. So why did you keep me?" He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet she had learned to read as preparation rather than deflection, the space a person takes when they are choosing, carefully, how to say a true thing. "Because I looked at you on that lawn," he said, "in front of 60 people who were all deciding what you were and what you had done and what it meant. And you looked back at all of them, and you were completely steady. You had just done something that had cost you everything you had built over years, and you were standing there, steady, and the thing I felt..." He stopped. I have been careful for a very long time. I have not let myself feel things that had no productive outcome. And then there you were, and I felt something, and I did not want to let you walk out of the building before I understood what it was. Nora held his gaze. And do you understand it now? Yes, she thought, not for the first time, about how peculiar it was, that the same impulse that had made her cross 12 feet of lawn had led, with the inevitability of cause and effect, to this room, this conversation, this person across this desk. She thought about the woman she had been at 22, committed to small and safe and sustainable, and about how small and safe had not, in the end, been quite as sufficient as she had told herself. She stood up from her desk. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of his chair and looked down at him. And he looked up at her. And she could see everything he had said still present in his face. Undefended. I am not a suitable person, she said, for a duke to have feelings about. I know. I am a housemaid from Southwark with 4 books in a tin box and references I assembled over 7 years of very hard work. I know all of that. And you are not a simple man. You come with a dukedom and a mother and a secret that is now ash but was real. And a life that is watched by 60 aristocrats whose interest you cannot simply ignore. I am aware. So. He reached up then and took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, with intention, without urgency, and held it. Just that. The simplest thing in the world and the most complicated. So, he said quietly, tell me what you want, not what is suitable, not what makes sense, what you want. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, you. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. Society said a great many things, and it said them with the energy that the English aristocracy reserved for situations it had not anticipated and could not immediately classify. The most charitable interpretation, offered by those who wished to be seen as modern in their thinking, was that the Duke had been moved by gratitude. A young woman of no particular standing had, through some improbable series of events, saved his life and demonstrated qualities that had impressed him, and he had acted accordingly. This was the version people told when they wanted to be seen as generous. The less charitable interpretation, which circulated with considerably more velocity, was that Nora Wickham was a designing woman who had manufactured the garden incident to catch a duke's attention, and that any man foolish enough to install a housemaid as his secretary for 6 weeks deserved whatever followed. This version was told by people who had not achieved what they wanted through conventional means, and found the achievement of it through unconventional ones offensive on principle. The Marchioness of Ellerton, who considered herself the final arbiter of such matters, declared the entire affair deeply irregular and reserved further comment, which everyone understood to mean she had not yet decided how to feel about it and was exercising the social prerogative of the powerful to simply wait. The Marquis Voss was silent. He discovered the theft within hours of returning from his Thursday card party and had said nothing, which was both expected and revealing. A man with legitimate grievances speaks publicly. A man whose grievances depend on evidence he no longer has learns very quickly that noise only illuminates his position. He waited 2 months before making his move, which suggested he had spent those 2 months trying to find another angle and failed. In October, with the season over and London thinning toward its country house version, the story began circulating. Vague, unsubstantiated, naming no names directly, but unmistakable in its direction. Sterling had anticipated it down to the approximate timing. The legal review of the title history was complete. The historian's account, dry, scholarly, and entirely supportive of the conventional narrative, had been placed in 3 separate archives where it would be found by anyone who looked. The solicitor had been briefed on how to respond to specific inquiries in specific terms. When Voss's version of events began circulating, it met a structure that had been built specifically to receive it. A story needs somewhere to land. Sterling had ensured there was nowhere for this one to go. Within 3 weeks, the story had lost its momentum entirely, and the social conversation had shifted to what it was always more comfortable with, the behavior of the person making the accusation rather than the person being accused. Voss made one final attempt in November, at a dinner to which he had invited himself. A statement in itself. He confronted Sterling in front of witnesses, with the particular combination of desperation and wounded pride that tends to end public reputations. He said things that were, in the cold morning air, regrettable. Sterling said nothing. He did not need to. He had learned from Nora the particular power of steadiness in the face of noise. By the following week, it was Voss whose name was being discussed in disapproving tones. The matter was over. The Marchioness of Ellerton delivered her verdict at the end of November. She delivered it, as she delivered everything of consequence, at her own morning call, a Tuesday, with 6 witnesses of impeccable standing seated in a drawing room that had hosted the decisive social conversations of 4 decades. Nora was not present. She heard about it that evening from Sterling, who had heard it from his mother, who had heard it from Lady Forsyth, who had been in the room. What the Marchioness had said, according to the account that travelled through 3 women before reaching Nora, was this: that the Duke of Callanvale had always been a man of exceptional judgment, that the Marquis Voss had always been a man of exceptional grievance, and that anyone who had watched the latter attempt to destroy the former over the past months could draw their own conclusions about which one of them was to be believed. She had then said, without particular emphasis, that she had called on the Duchess of Callanvale. She used the title without preamble, as if it had been established fact for years rather than weeks, and found her to be precisely the kind of woman the Callanvale household had required for some time. Sharp, practical, not in the least interested in whether anyone approved of her. She had paused, at that point, to take a small sip of tea. "Ah, I approve of her," she had then said, into the silence of 6 women who understood exactly what that meant. For what it is worth, it was worth a great deal. They all knew it. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted in the way that conversations shift when the Marchioness of Ellerton speaks, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady, inevitable quality of a tide coming in. Invitations began to arrive. Morning calls were paid. The season of 1824 opened with the Duke and Duchess of Callanvale firmly in their place within it, and the only people who said anything contrary were the ones whose opinions had never carried much weight to begin with. Nora received the news of Ellerton's verdict with the same steadiness she received everything. Then she set it in the category of things she had noted but did not need to feel excessively about. Then she allowed herself, privately, for approximately 30 seconds, to feel very pleased indeed. He asked her on an evening in November, when the fire was high and the study was warm, and the city outside was doing its autumn thing of pressing darkness against the windows earlier than expected. They had been working. She on a letter to the estate's primary tenant farmer, he on something to do with Parliament that he had been reading with the focused displeasure he reserved for politics. She had not been thinking about it. That was the honest version. She had been thinking about the letter and about the precise phrasing of the 3rd paragraph, and then he said her name, and she looked up, and the expression on his face made the letter entirely irrelevant. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it truthfully, not carefully. I always answer truthfully. You answer carefully. There is a difference, and you know it." She set down her pen. "Ask, will you marry me?" It was not phrased as a question, technically, which was very much like him. He delivered it the way he delivered everything consequential, with a directness that removed the space for deflection and left only the actual answer. She thought about what she had said to him in this room 2 months ago. "I am not a suitable person." She thought about his answer. "I know." And the answer had not been dismissal or minimization. It had been the acknowledgement of a man who had looked at the full picture and decided the picture was what he wanted, unsuitable components and all. She thought about the latch on the door of her room upstairs, about what she had not let herself feel about it. She let herself feel it now. "There will be an enormous amount of noise," she said. "There already is. We have been managing it for months. Your mother will have opinions. She has expressed 9 so far. 7 were favourable." A pause. The unfavourable 2 were primarily about the roses at the proposed wedding ceremony, which she feels strongly about. Nora looked at him. He looked back. The fire was warm. and the room was full of the particular solidity that comes from two people who have worked in a space together long enough that it has absorbed something of both of them. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, carefully, as if he had been holding it for longer than the conversation accounted for. "Yes," she said again, for the pleasure of saying it. The Dowager Duchess of Callanvale, Caroline Halloway, née Forsyth, 62 years old, possessed of the upright posture of a woman who had been told since childhood that a straight back was a moral position, received them in her Grosvenor Square sitting room on a Wednesday afternoon, with a pot of tea she did not immediately offer to share. She examined Nora for a long moment. Nora met her gaze steadily. She had looked at a great many people over 22 years of navigating rooms where she was assessed on sight, and she had learned that the only effective response to being weighed was to present your actual weight without apology. "Bah, you are the girl," the Dowager said, "who kissed my son in the Ashworth garden." "Yes." "And who subsequently retrieved a letter from the Marquis Voss that has been used to trouble this family for some years." "I retrieved a document that had no rightful owner. I would not describe it as a theft." The Dowager considered this. She turned to Sterling, who had the expression of a man watching something unfold, with the combination of apprehension and interest that only very specific situations produce. "She argues well. I have noticed. She will need to." The Dowager poured 2 more cups of tea, which was its own kind of statement. "The Ton will be absolutely dreadful about this for at least 18 months. Possibly 2 years. People will say things at parties. Letters will be written. The Ellerton woman will have much to express." She handed Nora a cup with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided something and was now simply acting on it. "My husband," she said, "was not a good man. I knew this by the 2nd year of our marriage and spent the next 39 managing the consequences." She looked at Nora directly. "You are a considerably better prospect than he was in the ways that actually matter. You are honest and capable, and you have already proved that you will act when action is required." A pause. "You are also entirely unsuitable, and I want you to understand that I am saying that as a factual description of the social landscape, and not as an objection." "I understand the distinction," Nora said. "Good." The Dowager picked up her own cup. "Then we shall have tea, and you will tell me what you think about the roses for the ceremony, because Sterling has no opinion on flowers, and someone in this family must." They were married on the 14th of January, 1824, in a ceremony that was small by ducal standards, and larger than anything Nora had ever stood at the centre of. The church was cold. The flowers were the Dowager's roses, forced in the greenhouse since October for exactly this purpose, white and unassuming and smelling, in the cold air, more intensely than roses had any right to. The pews were full. Mrs. Price sat in the 3rd row. Sterling had invited her personally, in a letter that had arrived at Ashworth Manor with the ducal seal, which Mrs. Price had apparently held in her hands for a full minute before opening. She had come, and she sat with the ramrod posture of a housekeeper who had decided this was a respectable occasion and intended to treat it accordingly. Ada Brewster sat beside her. She had cried, which had surprised Nora, who had not expected to be cried over. She had found, to her further surprise, that she did not mind. There was no one from Southwark. There was no one from her childhood, because the people of her childhood were mostly gone, or lost to her in the way that people become lost when the lives they are living diverge entirely from the lives you are living, and the distance becomes too large to bridge. She had made her peace with this long ago. She carried her origins inside her, in her knowledge and her instincts, and the precise, economical way she assessed a room. She did not need them to be present for them to be real. She walked up the aisle alone. She had always walked alone. She was not made less by it. Sterling stood at the front of the church with the stillness that was his. And when she reached him, he looked at her in that way. The way that was not the Duke, but the man. The one she had first seen on a lawn in June, and had been learning ever since. And she felt, in the same wordless place where she had kept her survival instincts, something settle, something that had been braced for a long time, that did not need to brace anymore. She married him with her eyes open. She would not have had it any other way. 3 years after the garden party at Ashworth Manor, 3 years, almost to the day, Nora sat at the window of the Callanvale study in the late afternoon light. The roses in the garden below were blooming again. They bloomed every year, unhurried by anything that had happened or would happen. And she had developed, over 3 years of watching them from this window, a kind of fondness for their indifference. Their daughter was asleep upstairs, Clara Halloway, 8 months old, with her father's focused expression and her mother's habit of assessing a room before committing to it. She slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with a seriousness that the nursemaid found slightly unnerving and which Nora found entirely familiar. The household was quiet in the way that happy households were quiet in the late afternoon. Not empty, but inhabited by people who had enough to do and enough ease to do it without urgency. The estate accounts were in the best order they had been in 30 years. The correspondence was current. The staff had, over 3 years, settled into the peculiar equanimity that follows the resolution of a prolonged uncertainty. They had expected a great deal of drama from this marriage, and the drama had largely failed to materialize. And in the absence of drama, they had found a household that ran well, and a mistress who was difficult but fair, which was, in the experience of most of them, the best you could realistically hope for. Sterling was at his desk. He was always at his desk in the late afternoon. He was reading the letter from the estate manager in Lincolnshire, which she had read first and left on the corner of his desk with a marginal note that said the 3rd paragraph contained an error in the accounting that he should look at before responding. He looked up from the letter. "Yeah, the 3rd paragraph. The figures don't reconcile with the October report. I see it. Write back and ask him to resubmit." "I was going to. I know," she said. "I'd just like to say it first." The smile. 3 years of it, and she still felt the precise quality of it. The way it changed everything it touched. The way it was entirely different from the careful expressions she had first catalogued on a lawn in June 1823, and had spent the months after that learning to distinguish from the real ones. She turned back to the window, the garden, the roses, the long summer light that came in at an angle she had learned to use as a clock. Downstairs, she could hear the housekeeper, the new one, younger than Mrs. Price, and still slightly nervous around her, speaking to the cook about the evening meal. In the nursery above, Clara would be waking soon, and there would be the particular small sounds of that process. She thought, sometimes, about the woman she had been at 22, the precise inventory of her possessions, the careful economy of her expectations, the discipline of wanting only what survival required. She did not think of her with condescension. That woman had kept her alive. That woman had built the skills and the references and the steadiness that had made everything else possible. She owed her a great deal. But she had also been wrong about one thing. She had believed that wanting large things was a form of foolishness, that the gap between what a person like her could have and what a person like her could want was a gap that only led to pain, and that the intelligent response was to want within your reach. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that the reach was longer than she knew, that the gap between having and wanting could be crossed, not by having the right name or the right birth or the right connections, but by the willingness to act in the half-second between knowing something and calculating whether it was safe to act on it. 4 seconds on a lawn, 12 feet of manicured grass, one decision made before the thinking mind caught up. The whole of this life. Contained in that. "Clara will be awake," Sterling said from his desk. "In 10 minutes. "You can't possibly know that. I have been charting her sleep schedule for 3 months. She wakes in 10 minutes. A pause. Then, with the tone she was fondest of, the dry, the warm, the entirely sincere. "Of course you have." She stood up from the window. She crossed the room. She stopped at his desk and looked at the letter from Lincolnshire and at the marginal note she had made, and then at him, and he looked up at her in the way that was the man and not the Duke, and she thought that this ordinary, complicated, imperfect, entirely real thing was not what she had dreamed of at 22, because she had not known how to dream it. She was glad she had not known. Knowing would have made her afraid of it. Instead, she had acted without calculation, on a June afternoon, and it had led her here, to this room, this man, this daughter sleeping upstairs who would inherit, whether she liked it or not, both her parents' tendency to assess a room before committing to it, and their habit of acting decisively when they did. Outside, the roses bloomed. The season continued without them. The Tun said things, as it always would, and it mattered somewhat less than it used to. In the study, two people sat together in the late afternoon light, and the third paragraph of the Lincolnshire letter contained an error, and Clara woke up in precisely 9.5 minutes. And it was enough. It was, in the way that real things are, everything. Did this story stay with you? Subscribe so you never miss one, and leave a comment. Which moment hit you hardest? The garden, the midnight study, or the last page?